I think for a lot of people, there are some one or two things they come across and they say, well, if this item here is true, it blows everything that I ever thought about the case upside down.
Well, if it's something that happened at the time and it stayed with me and I could just never let it go. When Oswald had his press conference on Friday evening, someone said to him, "Did you shoot the president?" And his answer was, "Nobody axed me." A-X-E-D. Nobody asked me about that. And I thought, how could you be that stupid to say something like that? No, it should have been nobody has asked me that. And then the closer I got to it, and it didn't take long, it's just assumed that Oswald was fluent in Russian. I'm thinking, this guy wasn't fluent in English. And I took up the study of the Russian language, and I realized within about an hour of dealing with the Russian language that Lee Oswald could never have mastered the Russian language. And from there, I just kept going. Who is he? Who was Marina? And you find some just amazing things. Rachel Oswald, who's going to turn 50 years old, she was asked, "What do you think of your Uncle Robert Oswald?" And she said, "I've never met, spoken to, or seen Robert Oswald." And that blew me away. There was a challenge thrown down to Robert Oswald. Give us a DNA sample, because we want to match it up, Lee Oswald's two daughters. And he wouldn't do it. And he could have destroyed many, many years of several people's research simply by giving that sample, just by putting it on the block and saying, here it is, but he refused to do it. And that's telling. There were numerous instances, more than you can count, where Oswald is somewhere where he couldn't have been. The Warren Commission published, among other unnecessary items, Oswald's report cards. And in one instance, they published his report card from the fall, I believe it was 1953, when he was a student in a middle school, junior high in New York City. They also published, a few pages later, his report card from a school in Louisiana at the same time. So you got Lee Oswald, student in Louisiana, present most of the time, 65 days. Lee Oswald, student in the Bronx, same semester, same year, present 67 days. His passport applications, night and day different. The first time he applied for a passport, his mother was a certain age, his father was a certain age. When he applied the second time, his mother got much older, his father got much younger. And he spelled his mother's name wrong, which was one of those things that it was like fingernails on a blackboard. His spelling is horrendous in the English language, but in Russian, his spelling is perfect. And I defy anybody that has a background in linguistics to tell me how that happens. And as a corollary to that, the Warren Commission was concerned. How could this guy's spelling be as bad as it was? Because he had a tendency to squeeze words together. If he tried to spell a 12-letter word, he'd spell it in 8 letters. And they did a study. They commissioned the Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota, to do a study. And I used to carry those words in my pocket when I went to educational conferences, and I'd pull it out and I'd say to the muckety-muck, what can you tell me about the person that spells these words like this? And they'd look at it and they'd say, how old is this? I said, 22. Oh, my God. Severe handicap in language. Yeah, okay. Could that person just sit down and teach himself Russian? Not a chance. What the study proved at the Mayo Clinic, and of course the Warren Commission didn't do anything with it because they didn't like what it said, they said when Oswald looked, he could not capture the full field of a long word, like independence, or let's say a word like bookkeeper. And when he tried to spell it, he'd botch it because he couldn't capture the full field of that word.
Or be good enough to be considered an interpreter for his Russian ability.
Yeah. I kid people. If Will Fritz had said to Oswald, tell me what a declension is, Oswald would have looked at him like, don't ask me questions I don't know. And the Russian language, believe me when I tell you, it is extremely difficult. It's got a whole different alphabet, and the difference between printing and script is monumental. You have to know when you reach a stressed or unstressed syllable, and that's a challenge in English. The words are so long, and it's a lazy, guttural language for the people that speak it. I don't remember the last time we spoke, but I went to Russia a couple of times. just to see how good my ability was, to get around and whatnot. And as it turned out, I brought a woman from Russia back with me. She went through Oswald's writing with me. She said, it's perfect. It's better than most Russians could do. And then I showed English spelling. And she said, how long was he in Russia? I said, 2.5 years. And she just said, no, not possible. Not possible. And his time is all taken up. So where did he learn Russian? Because one thing that comes through loud and clear, and it came through in my work, there are too many times and too many places where there's too many Oswalds. And some of it is simply someone setting Lee Oswald up with a resume. He tried to get to Cuba when he went to Mexico, if he did any of the stuff, because he went to embassies. And going to an embassy does not get you anywhere. If you want to travel someplace, Cuba, Russia, you go to a consulate. He somehow worked his way out of the Marines on a hardship discharge, which, by the way, was not documented in any imaginable way. In America today, you cannot get a hardship from your job or from anything without immense documentation. And when all the documentation is checked, whoever is going to grant that disability is going to pick a medical individual and say, you're going to go and visit this character, and you're going to make a decision. There was no hint whatsoever documented that Oswald needed a hardship discharge. They wanted to get him out of the Marines so he could get to Russia in decent weather. But he had a resume that just, wow, it's perfect. He's an assassin. But if you flip the coin on Oswald's resume, and if Khrushchev had been killed in a limousine on November 22nd, Oswald had the resume for that too. He quit school when he was 16 years old and sat in the recruiting office till he turned 17 so he could join the Marines. He was gung-ho. He worked at a top secret CIA installation in Atsugi, Japan, with the U-2 aircraft. He, quote, defected to Russia and came back, and with photographs that he'd taken with a very small and very expensive camera. So the two resumes exist. It's just a matter of which file you want to pull out. There's a case in point where when you accumulate the data, all of a sudden patterns start to emerge. And the one thing that I found, and I found an awful lot of connections of all places, not the CIA and not ONI, but U.S. Army intelligence. And one of several things that happened in an odd way over the weekend of the assassination was they said that Army intelligence had a file on Henry Lee Oswald, but it was destroyed while being thermofaxed. In 1963, you put one page of a document into a cylinder that rotated rapidly and had a phone connection attached to it. Where you were sending that file, they had to have a phone connection operative in the machine, and the document came out at the other end. But it was done one page at a time. So to say the file was destroyed by being thermofaxed, it meant they burned up one sheet of paper after another. And it doesn't happen that way. If you start one file, you're not going to start a second one. And going back to his Russian ability, there's a document in the Warren Commission files. It's dated January 1961, that was before he married Marina. It's a letter from someone in Russia named Ernest Tidovets, who was a friend of Oswald's in Russia, and the letter was sent to Texas. So obviously it's not 1961. The Warren Commission fudged it. And the reasons for that become apparent as you get into it. It's a 2-page letter. The first page and a half are in Russian, and they're to Marina. The final half page is to Alec, and it's in English, explaining what was written to Marina in Russian. And it mentioned, your baby's going to be a year old soon. Now, the first child was born February 15th of 62. So this January letter would be January of 63. But if a Russian friend of Oswald's is writing to Marina in Russian and to Lee in English and explaining what the Russian says, that tells us a whole lot about Oswald's Russian ability. Another thing I discovered, when you overlay the U-2 aircraft, which Oswald had something to do with in Japan, but he couldn't help the Russians shoot the thing down unless he could develop a missile system that would go high enough to shoot it down. Oh, let me ask you a question. What kind of factory did Oswald work in when he was in Minsk? Do you remember?
Radio factory.
Yeah, and it's generic. It's just like in Stalingrad when the Nazis and the Russians fought over the tractor factory. This was the radio factory. But oddly enough, there were too many coincidences to call them coincidences. That factory also produced experimental radar. And Oswald had been a radar operator in the Marine Corps. Again, the chronology of the U-2. It's shot down on May the 1st of 1960. Very soon thereafter, Oswald joins the hunting club at the radio factory, which allows him to purchase a shotgun, not a rifle. Rifles are illegal. Were illegal in the Soviet Union for reasons that became obvious in Dallas, Texas in 1963. He bought the gun for his own protection. Oswald then attended the trial of Gary Powers in August. And as soon as that trial was over, he began the steps to get himself brought home. And none of that's an accident. And in my thinking about all of this, I think Oswald originally, and probably unknowingly, was the scheduled U-2 patsy, because Eisenhower grilled Alan Dulles about the U-2 and said, look, what's the deal with this aircraft? Dulles says, nothing to worry about. It can't be shot down. The Russians have nothing that they can get it with. Okay, Eisenhower says, what about if the plane has some kind of mechanical failure? And Dulles just laughed the thing off. He said, it's constructed so lightly, it will disintegrate on the way down. And at 68,000 feet, a pilot does not want to jump out of a plane because of the pressure. They wanted to get as much intel as they could before the Paris Summit Conference, because once the Paris Summit Conference created détente in 1960, we can't send an aircraft over Russia after that. So we got to find out what we can before you guys make nice at the Paris Summit. So Eisenhower said, all right, fine, but make sure they go in April 1960. April 30th is the deadline. Well, it was already May in the United States when Powers took off. The plane that Powers was supposed to fly was literally taken off the taxiway for routine maintenance. And plane number 360 was put in its place. And Powers, in his own memoirs, said that plane was a dog. And few people realize it, but Gary Powers' flight was the first ever attempt to fly completely over the Soviet Union. On a day when Khrushchev had invested his political career in the fact that he and Eisenhower will be able to go to Paris and hammer out peace. Because that May Day, there was thousands of doves released, there were giant wooden doves in Red Square, and the American ambassador, Llewellyn Thompson, all of a sudden saw somebody with a lot of braid come running out on the top of Lenin's tomb. And there's a huddle. And he said, looking back, that was the moment when Khrushchev was told that they had shot down a U-2. And the U.S. said, yeah, one of our planes, got lost over a lake in Turkey. And that was the end. But my view on the whole thing is that it was meant to fail. And it was going to fail. But Powers wasn't going to be taken alive. And the blame would have fallen on Oswald. This all happened because a former Marine radar operator defected to the Soviet Union. He told them what to do. Powers alive, all bets off. So Oswald had patsy practice. He was the chump that was supposed to, everybody mad enough to finally, once and for all, root out their rat's nest in Cuba. And instead of America getting mad, they got sad. You followed the newspapers for 5, 8, 10 days. Less and less, Oswald is Cuban, communist. He's just a malcontent, a loner. The whole Cuban angle winds down tremendously. But initially, Heidel bought the rifle. Oswald didn't. How it was ever shipped or collected can't be explained, because Oswald had a post office box in Dallas, and the only person who could receive mail there was Lee H. Oswald. The rifle is sent to Alec Heidel, and Oswald collected it? How? If you mail me something to Alec Heidel, well, today it would probably just be put in my mailbox. But it doesn't work that way. And the pistol is even more bizarre, because he paid $10 down and the rest was COD. And it was shipped Railway Express to a post office box, which cannot be done. The only thing that can be put in a post office box is United States mail. Not UPS, not FedEx then, and certainly not Railway Express. And as a COD, who paid for it? The mailman didn't pay for it. And both guns had been rebarreled. Another coincidence. So you couldn't really do the kind of ballistic stuff you wanted to do because the guns had been rebarreled.
Well, I don't think anyone thinks that Carcano did anything that day.
Those things were imported, I believe, into your country, and they were bought by the pound. So some jobber brought over 4,000 pounds of surplus junk and was paid by the pound. Then they cannibalized what they had. This stock is still good. That trigger guard is still good. We can use that barrel. They cannibalized all the stuff and sold them for $3 wholesale. And then it winds up in a catalog for $12. And why anybody would put a scope on that gun is unimaginable, because there's no real place to mount it. The gun that he supposedly ordered was not the one he got, the model number. And as a curiosity, the one that he ordered could have been broken down and would have been small enough when broken down that he could have carried it the way Wesley Frazier described it, cupped in his hand under his armpit. But the one that was found in the book depository was 34 inches when broken down, and you got to be a serious basketball player to put that thing in your palm and stick it under your armpit. So none of it works. Where did he get the ammunition? Where did the sling come from? Where did the clip come from? Never explained, just assumed. And the FBI went through millions and millions of cartridges from rifle ranges in a 50 to 75 mile radius of Dallas-Fort Worth. And I think they came up with 80 possible Mannlicher Carcano cartridges, none of which matched the ejector marks from the gun found in the book depository. And there are some things that are absolutely fudged with regard to Jack Ruby. They published the Secret Service records of Jack L. Ruby up until 1943, because once he went in the service, the Selective Service has nothing to do with you anymore, the draft board. Once you're in the Army, they're done with you. So they've got the complete Selective Service records of Jack L. Ruby up to 1943. The problem is, Jacob Rubenstein did not become Jack L. Ruby until 1947. So whose records are these? Because I guarantee you, Ruby might have changed the name on his driver's license, but he damn sure didn't call a draft board in Illinois and say, I changed my name. Of course it didn't happen.